Lincoln's family had never been the outdoorsy type, but after Mike's recent affair that shook their 20-year marriage to its core, he insisted that a camping trip on the Appalachian Trail would help them reconnect. Claire wasn't convinced. She hadn't forgiven him for what he did. He'd betrayed her trust, sleeping with his secretary, and no amount of "I'm sorry" could take away the sting. Still, for the sake of their kids, 10-year-old Jake, who still idolized Mike, and 16-year-old Emma, who understood far more than anyone wanted to admit, she reluctantly agreed. Mike believed the camping trip would be the perfect way to patch things up, but Claire didn't buy it. This trip wasn't a solution. It was an attempt to run away from the damage they had caused. A change of scenery to distract from the pain still lingering. She knew it, and Mike probably did too. But for the kids, she would try. They arrived late in the afternoon, the dense fog of the Appalachian hills already rolling in, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. Claire shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat as Mike parked their little car, his hands gripping the wheel a little too tight. He wasn't a camper, neither was she, but he kept trying to make it sound like they could be reconnected by simply being in nature. "Let's just get this tent up," Mike said, brushing off the cold October air. "We'll do a quick hike after dinner, get the kids some exercise." Claire glanced over at Emma, who had her earbuds in and her phone clutched tightly. Emma was usually angry with her father, but there was something different in the air today. Her daughter had grown quiet over the past few months. A new layer of bitterness there that Claire couldn't quite explain. Emma was an expert at keeping her feelings hidden, but Claire could sense her frustration. "Emma," Claire called softly, "can you help me set up the tent?" Emma didn't respond at first, just scrolled through her phone like Claire wasn't speaking to her at all. Claire sighed, but then Emma's gaze flickered up, her eyes cool and detached. "I'm fine, just let me finish texting." Claire nodded. "Right." Jake, on the other hand, was thrilled to be outdoors. "Dad, can I help with the fire?" he asked eagerly. Mike shot him a proud smile, ruffling his hair. "Of course, buddy. Get the kindling, and I'll get the bigger logs." Claire couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Jake was so eager to please, so ready to earn his father's approval. But Emma? Emma had stopped seeking Mike's approval long ago. As they set up camp, Mike and Jake worked together, building a small fire, while Claire helped unpack the rest of their gear. Her thoughts kept returning to Emma, to the way she'd shut down ever since the affair. It wasn't just the usual teenage angst, it was something deeper, something Claire wasn't sure how to fix. When they sat down to eat, Emma barely looked up from her phone. She poked at her food, her usual teenage disinterest obvious. "Emma, can't you give it a try? Have some fun?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice light. Emma shrugged, without meeting her mother's eyes. "It's fine, I'm just not hungry." "Why don't you put the phone away for a bit?" Mike said. His tone clipped. "We're here to spend time together." Emma's gaze flicked toward him, but she didn't respond. She didn't have to. The tension between her and Mike was palpable. He was trying, sure, but Emma was too smart to be fooled. She knew exactly why they were here, and it wasn't to reconnect, it was to bury the past. The morning came too quickly, with the sounds of the forest outside filling their tent. Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to the birds and the rustle of leaves. There was a sense of quiet desperation about the whole trip. It wasn't going the way Mike hoped, and Claire, she was just going through the motions. After breakfast, they hiked deeper into the woods. Jake practically bounced along the trail, eyes wide as he explored every rock, every stick. He tried to tell Mike every little thing he noticed, hoping for approval. "Dad, look, I think I found a deer track." Jake pointed to the ground excitedly, his voice high-pitched with joy. Mike smiled, kneeling next to him to inspect. "Nice work, buddy. That's some good observation." Claire watched them, feeling a pang in her chest. Why couldn't Mike see how hard Emma tried too? But Emma wasn't the type to beg for attention. She was just angry. But why? "Mom, do you think we'll see any bears?" Jake asked, running back to Claire's side. Claire forced a smile. Probably not. Bears stay away from people, but let's be careful just in case. As they walked deeper into the woods, Claire kept noticing how quiet Emma was. She wasn't texting, she wasn't complaining, she just walked. The tension between them was thick, suffocating, but Emma wasn't saying anything. As they made their way back to camp, Claire tried to engage Emma again. You okay? Emma gave her a tight smile, her eyes distant. Yeah, fine. But Claire knew better. Fine wasn't the word to describe what was simmering under the surface. The unspoken anger was so much more than what could be expressed in a few words. That night, Claire stayed awake longer than usual. The sounds of the forest felt off, too quiet, too still. She heard the wind rustling the trees, but there was something else beneath it, something that didn't belong. By the third morning, the unease was unbearable. Claire could feel it in her bones. The isolation, the stillness of the woods made the world feel a little too empty. It started with small things that morning. A pair of larger tracks that looked similar to large footprints near the camp that didn't belong to any of them. Camp chairs moved slightly from where they had been left previously. After a day on the trail, the family returned to their camp to find a foreboding message. Scrawled in the ashes of their campfire the night before were the words, "Run, rabbit, run." Mike waved it off. Probably some hikers trying to mess with us. There's nothing to worry about. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Someone was watching them. Later that afternoon while they hiked, Claire tried to talk to Emma again. She found her daughter off to the side, looking more withdrawn than ever, her face shadowed with something Claire couldn't quite place. Emma, talk to me, please. You've been so distant lately. Emma stiffened, her gaze flicking toward her mother. I'm fine, Mom. Stop trying to fix everything. You can't. You don't get it. Get what? Claire's voice cracked with frustration. You and Dad, you think everything's going to go back to normal, but it's not. It's not normal anymore. The words hit Claire harder than she expected. She didn't know how to respond. Mike had tried to pretend things were fine, but Emma saw through them. She had seen everything. She knew about the affair, knew about the lies, and Claire, she felt like she was the only one who didn't know how to fix this. That night, Claire had a dream unlike any other. The forest around her was bathed in moonlight, but the trees were twisted, their trunks gnarled and deformed. A deep, unnatural chill hung in the air, and the silence was suffocating. Claire felt a presence behind her, a shadow stalking her every move. She turned, but there was nothing there, except the sound of rustling branches and the slow, deliberate creak of something moving toward her. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape too unnatural to be human. Its eyes, hollow, sunken, black as midnight, locked onto hers, and a chill shot down her spine. Run, it whispered in a voice that felt like it was coming from inside her own mind. They always run, Claire. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The creature's long, spindly fingers reached toward her, and just as it touched her, the ground beneath her feet gave way, plunging her into darkness. Claire woke with a start, gasping for air, her body slick with sweat. The darkness of the tent felt heavy, suffocating. She quickly sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream had felt too real, the terror too tangible. Shaking off the lingering dread from her dream, Claire tried to settle herself, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. She turned over, but then her eyes widened as she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The corner of the tent where the canvas met the ground, there, faint but unmistakable, were deep, jagged claw marks. Long and cruel, the scratches marred the surface as if something had raked its claws across the fabric, leaving behind unmistakable gouges. Claire's heart skipped. She was sure they hadn't been there before. The marks hadn't been there when they set up camp. Something had been there. Her breath hitched as she scanned the night around them, the sounds of the forest now unnervingly distant. Was it just her imagination, or had the air turned even colder? She sat up quickly, trying to steady her shaking hands. She didn't want to wake Mike, not yet. Not while she was still trying to piece together the strangeness of it all. But the doubt clawed at her, the unsettling sense that someone was lurking just beyond the trees. It wasn't just the unease she had been feeling all day. This was something different, something real. Tentatively, she unzipped the flap of the tent, careful not to wake Emma or Jake. She crept outside, her breath visible in the air. The campfire's embers were low, casting strange shadows on the ground. As Claire looked around, every tree and bush felt like it was watching her, the hairs on her neck standing at attention. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides. She walked a few steps away from the tent, glancing around the perimeter. Her eyes scanned the trees, the underbrush, the shadows. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in, suffocating. Suddenly, a rustling sound, a soft snap of a twig, made her freeze. Her body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. Was it an animal? The wind? "Mike," she whispered hoarsely, but the sound of her voice only made the silence feel more oppressive. She took another step forward, then froze again. There in the distance, a figure, tall, too tall, slipping between the trees just out of clear view. Her breath quickened. She backed up toward the tent, heart pounding, but the figure never came closer. It was just there. She could feel its presence like a weight in the air. She rushed back to the tent, unzipped the flap, and crawled in. Trying to steady herself, she tried to wake Mike quietly, but he stirred before she could even speak. "What's wrong?" he muttered sleepily. "Mike, I found something." Her voice was shaky as she looked back toward the entrance, her gaze flickering nervously. "There are marks on the tent. Something's been here." Mike blinked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Marks? What are you talking about?" Claire's voice trembled. "Claw marks, Mike. Big ones. Deep ones. They weren't there earlier. Something was outside the tent." Mike sat up, running a hand over his face. He wasn't fully awake yet, his brain foggy with sleep. All right. Let me check it out. Stay here, okay?" Claire nodded, but her eyes followed him as he stepped outside. Looking around the camp, she held her breath, praying he'd find something that would make sense of the fear clawing at her. Mike circled the camp, inspecting the ground, the trees, even the fire pit. When he returned, he had the same skeptical look he always wore when something seemed off. Nothing. No signs of anything. Just some disturbed dirt around the fire. "You probably just imagined it, Claire. We're in the woods. Animals mess with stuff sometimes." But Claire wasn't convinced. "You didn't see anything unusual out there?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike hesitated, looked past her, out into the woods, as if the quiet was starting to settle on him too. "No, nothing I haven't seen before." Still, Claire couldn't shake the feeling in her chest, the sense that something was out there, watching them, waiting. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but sleep didn't come easy for Claire. She could feel it. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck never lay flat. She stayed awake, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, waiting for something. The wind rustling the leaves, the odd snap of a branch, the whisper of a voice that sounded like her own. By the fourth day, Claire knew something was wrong. The sense of unease had only deepened overnight. The tension between her family had been replaced by a creeping dread. Whispers, knocks on the tent at odd hours, strange noises in the trees, and a bone-deep feeling of being followed. It all culminated into a suffocating moment when they realized that they were no longer alone. When the creature revealed itself, Claire was already bracing for the worst. It appeared in the trees, its figure gaunt, unnaturally tall, its features too sharp and too still to be human. The forest around it seemed to warp, the shadows elongating, bending with its presence. Claire froze, her heart slamming in her chest. There was no mistaking it. This was no wild animal. This was something far darker, far older. She could feel Emma's hand trembling in hers as they stood, rooted to the spot. Emma's eyes were wide with terror, but Claire held on, trying to anchor them both to reality. They had to get out. But the creature wasn't after Emma or Jake. It was after Claire. She could see it in the hollow eyes, eyes that were fixed only on her. It wanted her, and Emma and Jake, they were simply running for their lives. The creature spoke, and Claire's blood ran cold as its voice, distorted and twisted, echoed in her ears. It was her voice, twisted into something monstrous. Run. Run now. Chaos erupted. Mike, believing he had just heard his wife shout a command, grabbed Jake and Emma, pulling them toward the path they had come from. But Claire stood still, her feet heavy as stone. She knew what was coming. There was no escape from this thing. She wasn't going anywhere. With one final look at her children, Claire closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Mike managed to get his family back to the CRV, but as they hurried away, he suddenly realized Claire wasn't with them. He turned, looking frantically for her. She wasn't in step with them, wasn't even in sight. About 10 yards from the family SUV, Mike stopped dead. He stared at the windshield. Written in blood was a message that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They always run. Thanks for wandering into the shadows with me. If you enjoyed the chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let the darkness know you're here. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.